Welcome, everyone. I think everyone can hear me. My name is Christina Hartlieb, and I'm the Executive Director at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. We welcome you to our online presentation today. We are obviously still in learning mode, making this transition to online presentations as opposed to at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. It's not working the same way as we practiced on Thursday, so we're going to, continue for the first couple minutes here, getting it sorted out. All right, that is the, we might have to go with that one.
Okay.
That's the first one, like the first one that I saw, and
right.
It has the main screen and the next slide.
Okay.
But that might be as easy as we can get it for now.
Well, let's do it. That's fine because we
okay.
don't people.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started with that. Thank you all who are trying to help me figure out how to fix this issue. But we are going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Christina Hartlieb, and welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House's online presentation. Did you know that famed orator and abolitionist Frederick Douglass visited Cincinnati several times? Today, we are going to learn about the intersection of national and local anti-slavery movements with Dr. Robert Wallace. Dr. Wallace is Regents Professor of English at Northern Kentucky University, where he has taught since 1972. He currently teaches courses on Moby Dick and the Arts, Emily Dickinson and the Arts, and Frederick Douglass and Cincinnati anti-slavery. Professor Wallace has published books on Jane Austen and Mozart, Emily Bronte and Beethoven, Melville and Turner, Frank Stella's Moby Dick, Peggy and Shear's Moby Dick, and Douglass and Melville. His recent research on Frederick Douglass and anti-slavery activists in Cincinnati has appeared in the Daguerrean Society Quarterly and the New North Star. In 2019, Dr. Wallace received the Medallion Award from the University of Kentucky Libraries for Lifetime Intellectual Achievement. Dr. Wallace is also a member of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House and frequently attends our lectures and discussions himself. So thank you for being with us today. We are not going to be using the chat feature. I'm going to monitor just the question and answer section. So please submit any questions through the Q&A. I will then collate them and ask questions of Dr. Wallace at the end of his presentation. So now I'm going to let Dr. Wallace get started.
Okay, thank you, Christina. First, I want to congratulate you and your colleagues for all the great programming at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in the last couple of years. It's been wonderful. In a way, I'm sorry we can't be face-to-face in your wonderful sitting room, but this way we can reach a lot more people, which is great. And I have friends from Washington, D.C. who are probably tuning in. So anyone who's taking the time to watch us today, thanks for taking the time when our country is facing so many challenges. Douglass and Cincinnati anti-slavery is a subject I've been working on for about 4 or 5 years, and abolitionists in the 1850s in Cincinnati and anywhere else had huge challenges to face. And I've been very impressed with the people I've been studying in this project. And I'm going to start today by telling you about the visits Douglass did make here in the 1850s. He came here 5 times between 1850 and 56. I'm going to mention briefly also the first 2 times he couldn't make it. He avoided the city in 43. He had to cancel in 49, but he finally did get here in July of 50, came back in April of 52, April of 54, a quick trip in November of 54, and then again in March of 56. So these aren't very well known by Cincinnatians or by Douglass scholars, and it's been fascinating for me to learn about them. So I'm going to start by just going quickly through his visits, and then we'll turn to the people from Cincinnati who made those visits possible. So Douglass was born in 1818 and escaped from Maryland as a fugitive slave in 38 at age 20. He settled in New Bedford. He moved to Boston in 1841 to work for William Lloyd Garrison's organization. And in 43, still a very young man and still a fugitive, he toured the western states for about 4 months with fellow Garrisonians. He got as far west as Indianapolis. He was scheduled to speak in Cincinnati in October, but he was nearly murdered by a mob in Pendleton near Indianapolis, and his colleagues convinced him it'd be too dangerous for a fugitive to speak so close to Kentucky as Cincinnati is. So they arranged for him to speak through central Ohio rather than southern Ohio on the way back to Massachusetts. He later said he regretted that he'd been afraid to speak here then. The next trip would have been in July of 49. He was already editing the North Star newspaper in Rochester. He was going to arrive here in late July so he could give the West Indian Emancipation Address on August 1st. But he caught a fever on a lecture tour from Detroit to Cincinnati and reluctantly decided it'd be too dangerous to visit Cincinnati during that terrible cholera epidemic that broke out in that year. That was actually the epidemic that took the life of Harriet Beecher Stowe's infant son, Charlie. And that was during the week when Douglas would have arrived here. So the next year in April, she moved with her surviving children to Brunswick, Maine, and he came in July of that year. So they missed each other by about 3 months in Cincinnati. So his first visit was in July of 1850, and in May of that same year, he and his fellow Garrisonians had been driven out of New York City, and they weren't allowed to return for 3 more years. So we were kind of a refuge for him then. He came to Cincinnati on a boat from Buffalo across the lake to Sandusky, and 2 train companies brought him from Sandusky to Cincinnati. He gave 8 talks in 7 days, and he began his networking with both Black and white Cincinnatians, many of whom he had already written about in his North Star paper. This powerful photo of him was taken around 1850, but the city and photographer are still unknown. So he arrived on the Little Miami Railroad on the 4th of July. So he traveled right over the path that we use today for the Little Miami Bike Trail. He loved the beauty of the forests and the patriotism of the villagers he saw celebrating the 4th of July as his train passed through their little towns. In a letter he wrote the next day, he said, "I could almost have joined them were this not a common hunting ground for men," because he was very well aware that fugitive slaves were fleeing from northern Kentucky through this very river valley. So the day after he arrived, he gave 2 lectures in College Hall. That then belonged to Cincinnati College, which is now part of UC. And Cincinnati College Hall was on the corner of Walnut and Vine, actually where the Mercantile Library is today, a little higher in the air. There were Kentucky slaveholders in the audience who tried to disrupt the afternoon lecture, but Douglas wrote the next day, he praised the Ohio Buckeyes in the audience who threatened them into silence, and everything went fine, unlike in New York. His 8 talks that week concluded with a gala farewell at Baker Street Baptist, a Black church near 3rd and Walnut, just a block down from this College Hall. So he was here a week, but he published 4 essays in his paper about this visit. He wrote 2 letters from the editor in Cincinnati, and they appeared side by side in his July 15th issue, which is on the left there. They're pretty long letters too. In Columbus, he also wrote a letter, an essay about the colored citizens of Cincinnati. He was mobbed in Columbus at the Ohio State House, but he got away all right. Wrote this essay and sent to the paper. And then when he got back to Rochester, he wrote a 4th piece called Our Western Anti-Slavery Tour. And that tour was mainly in Cincinnati. So ironically, the issues of the North Star in which those last 2 essays appeared no longer exist. You can't find them anywhere, but fortunately they were each reprinted by the Anti-Slavery Bugle in Salem, Ohio. So those reprints have helped my research greatly. So he came back 2 years later in April of '52, and here he was the featured speaker for a 3-day convention in Cincinnati. He gave 4 major talks in 3 days. He participated in all the discussions. He helped write all the resolutions that passed. This anti-slavery convention repudiated the fugitive slave law that had been passed in 1850, a few months after he left. This convention strongly advocated political action to abolish slavery, as opposed to Garrison, who only believed in moral suasion. And this convention argued strongly for the responsibility of the Christian churches to oppose slavery, because most Protestant churches did not yet oppose slavery. So Douglass wrote soon after that this was the greatest anti-slavery convention ever held in the West. And he also wrote a personal essay, Jaunt to Cincinnati, in which he wrote that he was, quote, thrilled by the warm facts of history as they came blowing from brave hearts all around me. He didn't give praise easily. He was clearly very moved by his 3 days here to have written that. So his 52 talks were in Smith and Nixon Hall on the corner of 4th and Vine, and it's on the right here, and you can see it's right next to the printing house of the Gazette newspaper. This was a brand new hall that seated 1,500 people. And on the last 2 nights when Douglass spoke, more than 800 were turned away each of those nights. The Daily Gazette covered the entire convention session by session all 3 days. And Douglass reprinted that complete coverage verbatim the next week in the North Star. That really helped to make Cincinnati known. In August of the same year, he and 3 of the activists from this convention were major players at the National Convention of the Free Democratic Party in Pittsburgh. The 3 other activists were William Brisbane and Samuel Lewis from Cincinnati, and George W. Julian from Indiana. Douglass was elected secretary of that convention, and this was his baptism into direct political action. Well, 2 years after that, he came back, and again for a 3-day convention, and here he shared the spotlight with Lucy Stone. Douglass was now very much a political activist. Lucy Stone was still a Garrisonian who believed only in moral suasion. So they differed in strategy, but were equally passionate and eloquent. All voices at the convention joined in repudiating the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was then going through Congress, and which would have given the new territories of Kansas and Nebraska in the West the possibility to adopt slavery if they wished. This was widely thought to be the most electrifying convention on any subject the city had ever seen before the Civil War. This convention took place in Greenwood Hall, which is up on the 3rd floor of the Mechanics Institute at 6th and Vine. That hall held 1,500 people. And on the last night, for Stone and Douglass, they debated each other. 1,500 were turned away that night. It was an amazing evening. In that hall, there was a 23-foot map over the podium that showed the slave states in black, the free states in white, with Kansas and Nebraska in a gray color, showing they were still up for grabs. This annual Cincinnati convention, this was the 4th annual now, had become one of the few in the country where all factions of the fractious anti-slavery movement could be freely heard. So he stayed for at least a week after that 54 convention and networked with the Cincinnati's Black community. And a lot of that networking was the great Black daguerreotypist, J.P. Ball. And on May 5th, back in Rochester, Douglass published this engraving of Ball's great Western Daguerrean gallery on the front page of his newspaper, and that is the first engraving Douglass ever published of anything, the first image that appeared. It was all text until now. In that same week, he gave a lecture on Black self-help at the Zion Baptist Church, and he published yet another appreciative essay about the colored people of Cincinnati. His journalistic praise of Black Cincinnatians had begun before he came here, actually, in 1848, with 3 letters written from the city by his co-editor then, Martin Delaney. So in 56, he came back in March in the wake of the Margaret Garner tragedy. He lectured again at Smith and Nixon Hall this year, and it was 3 days after Margaret Garner was sent back with the rest of her surviving family to her master in Northern Kentucky, this being after she had killed her own infant daughter to save her from returning to a lifetime of slavery. It was a big national trial and got a lot of attention. And Douglas called Garner the heroic slave mother. He covered her trial, conviction, and its aftermath continuously for months in his paper. He was hoping that her desperate act would help the newly forming National Republican Party oppose slavery in the South, as well as in Kansas and Nebraska. Ohio had elected Salmon P. Chase as its first Republican governor in 55, but even though he was widely known as anti-slavery, he said he would not touch slavery in the South. It was only in Kansas and Nebraska, and that was really the position of the whole party. So Douglas was very much in the minority as someone interested in the Republican Party that really wanted it to take on slavery in the South. This is an 1856 photo whose city and photographer are also unknown. So now I'm going to turn to 4 white-appearing Cincinnatians who enabled and enriched Douglas's visits. I hope you know some of these 4 figures. I didn't know a lot about them till I started the research, but I've become extremely impressed with all of them, so we'll give a little attention to each one. Sarah Ernst was born in Boston in 1809, and I have found no photo of her. So the surrogate photo here is one that's Gilbert Stuart, famous for painting George Washington, painted of Sarah's mother in 1809, the year she gave birth to Sarah. So Sarah Ernst grew up as a Garrisonian abolitionist in Boston. But in 1841, she fell in love with Andrew Ernst, a Cincinnati horticulturalist, and she moved here to his spring garden estate and nursery. 2 years later, she founded the Ladies Anti-Slavery Sewing Society and ran it for 10 years. By 1849, she was the mother of several children and decided she also wanted to awaken Cincinnati to the sin of slavery itself, in addition to just clothing the fugitives who came through. So she held an anti-slavery bazaar to raise money to sponsor that first visit Douglas made in 1850. That was so successful, her sewing society sponsored 5 consecutive 3-day conventions in the next 5 years. These conventions made Cincinnati a national center of anti-slavery enlightenment. We know about the Underground Railroad here, but not enough is known about these conventions. The featured speakers were an amazing group of national figures: Samuel Ringgold Ward in 51, Douglas in 52, William Lloyd Garrison in 53, Douglas and Stone together in 54, and William Wells Brown in 55. In Cincinnati, Sarah Ernst became known as the Alpha and Omega of Cincinnati anti-slavery, although she is not remembered as such today. This is her husband's spring garden nursery in 39, 2 years before she came, and that little bridge, that's Harrison Pike crossing Mill Creek before it goes up into what are now Western Hills. And this area is the site of the Western Hills Viaduct today. Ernst was called the pioneering horticulturalist of the West. And by 1843, when she was already here, he published a catalog advertising over 400 varieties of both apples and pears. He raised a lot of other stuff too. So this lithograph is from 1850, the year that Douglas came. And the Ernst, he was very busy that week, but the Ernsts had him over for a large reception at their home one afternoon and introduced him to the leading Black and white abolitionists of the city. And he wrote about that visit in that essay on our Western Anti-Slavery Tour, which got reprinted in the Anti-Slavery Bugle. And he wrote there that Spring Garden was the most beautiful landscape garden he'd ever seen anywhere in America. So this is the issue of the Bugle that reprinted that article. And on the left, you have a very long paragraph talking about the beautiful landscaping, the slope of the city with a view of Cincinnati, how amazing the Ernsts were as wealthy Americans who gave so much to the abolitionist movement, and also mentioned that no fugitive came to their door without getting help. So that paragraph itself was a tribute. And by the way, this is the only notice I've seen anywhere of this visit. If the Bugle had not reprinted that, there'd be no way of knowing about this visit that he made, the reception that was given to him. So down at the bottom, he talks about the reception. There we met our esteemed friends, Dr. Brisbane, Levi Coffin, William Watson, John Gaines, and William Casey. There were others present whose names escape our recollection, because remember, he's writing this several weeks later from Rochester. And he concluded by saying, in company with such a band, days were but hours and hours but minutes. So this reception at Spring Garden Estate really set the tone for his whole visit. And it obviously touched him very deeply. So this is a contemporary view of Cincinnati from that sloping hillside just above where the Ernst estate was, and you can see what a sweeping view they have of the whole Miami River Valley. So Andrew Ernst died in 1860, and she had 5 children by then, and she moved back to Boston and raised her family as young Bostonians from that point on. But when she died in 82, she had arranged for her remains to be shipped back to Cincinnati, where they were buried next to Andrew in Spring Grove Cemetery. So you can go there and look at these markers for their bodies. On the left is a painting it's a photograph of a painting by Andrew Ernst by Robert Duncanson, the great Black Cincinnati painter, and it's full length, it's 7 feet tall. And the painting probably doesn't exist. What happened is Duncanson painted this sometime in the 50s. It was given to the Mercantile Library after Ernst died. Around 1905, when no one remembered Ernst much and when Duncanson was unknown by that time, the library gave this painting to the Colored Orphans Asylum. And about 1940, the Ernst descendants in Boston got interested. They were looking through their family stuff and saw this photo that was taken of this painting, a black and white photo, and connected up in Cincinnati to see where the painting itself was, and they hired detectives even, couldn't find it. So this photo was found for me by Joe Kettner, the late specialist in Duncanson, who found it among the Ernst family papers in the Massachusetts Historical Society. So sometimes works like this get preserved somewhere in an attic. So if you find this in your attic, let me know. It'd be worth probably hundreds of thousands of dollars today. So our next Cincinnatian is in the center of this triple daguerreotype, and his name is William Brisbane, and these are 2 of his friends. On our left is Andrew Harwood, who is his right-hand man in his anti-slavery active here, and on our right is Levi Coffin, who ran the Underground Railroad famously, and who is about 15 years younger in this photo than any other image we have of him. This triple daguerreotype was taken by the Black photographer J.P. Ball in October of '53, right before Brisbane moved to the frontier of Wisconsin because he could no longer support his family here, even though he was a very active man. Later, a sketch of this daguerreotype was published in a Cincinnati paper, and these 3 were identified as the board of managers for the Underground Railroad. We know about Coffin's involvement, but not so much about Brisbane's and Harwood's. So Brisbane, when he moved, he was raised in Cincinnati in South Carolina in a slaveholding family. So he became a slaveholder as he grew up. He also became a medical doctor and a Baptist preacher. But in the mid 1830s, he decided slavery was wrong. He sold his slaves and moved his whole family to Cincinnati in 1838 as pastor of the First Baptist Church. And he lived in this house in Cheviot near Hamilton Pike, just over the hill from the Ernst, and this house still stands. It's not far from the water tower in Cheviot today. He was quite quickly dismissed from the First Baptist Church for his anti-slavery views, and he made those views more prominent. He also decided that it wasn't enough to sell his slaves because they were still enslaved down there, so he arranged to repurchase them and brought them here as freed individuals to Cincinnati, and Salmon P. Chase, the lawyer, helped him with the paperwork for that. So from then on, he was a leading abolitionist until he moved to Wisconsin a decade later. He was a Liberty Party politician. He preached in the Black Baptist churches after the white ones did not want him anymore. He wrote anti-slavery treatises and novellas. He published anti-slavery paper here in Cincinnati, and he founded an anti-slavery action committee. Unfortunately, he didn't get enough money from these activities to be able to support his family. So another thing he did, very busy man, he kept a diary for the whole 15 years he was here in Cincinnati. That diary is up in Wisconsin, in the Wisconsin Historical Society that also has that triple daguerreotype. And this is an amazingly rich documentation of the lives of abolitionists in Cincinnati from throughout the 40s and into the early 50s. And it's been a great help to me, obviously, in writing the book I'm writing. So Brisbane was Sarah Ernst's right-hand man in running those first three anti-slavery conventions. He invited some of the out-of-town guests, and he ran them like clockwork, the conventions themselves. She was a Garrisonian, and he was a political activist. So they differed on strategy, but they set the tone together for all sides being heard here in Cincinnati. He was a national leader in the transition from the Free Democratic Party in '52 to the National Republican Party in '56. And Frederick Douglass in the North Star, and then his own name paper, the Frederick Douglass paper, covered Brisbane's political, literary, and religious activity in both of those papers. Like Sarah Ernst, Brisbane was a hero of Cincinnati anti-slavery who's hardly known for that today. When the Civil War started, Salmon P. Chase became Secretary of Treasury under Lincoln, and he invited Brisbane to become a federal tax commissioner in his home state of South Carolina, where he confiscated land from his former friends who owned plantations when they couldn't pay their taxes, or a lot of them actually abandoned their plantations, and sold plots of these lands to former slaves who were now free for about 8 years. Another amazing period in the life of William Brisbane. So on the night before that first 3-day Cincinnati convention for Douglass, when he came in town, Brisbane and Douglass met on the left here at Dumas House, which was called Dumas Hotel now, and it was the only hotel in Cincinnati where blacks can stay. And Douglass was presumably staying there that night. That's at any rate, they met there and went over all of the resolutions that would be presented the next 3 days. They worked out the wording together. And many of those same resolutions were adopted by the Free Democratic Party at the National Convention in August, at which Brisbane and Douglass were both national officers. So our third white Cincinnatian is Henry Blackwell. He was a young Cincinnati hardware merchant who just kind of appeared and spoke very eloquently at the 1852 convention. So he went back east to look at other conventions and fell in love with Lucy Stone, who was speaking both in New York and Boston that year. And as a way of trying to court her, he organized a Western tour for her in October of '53 that began in Cincinnati, went into Kentucky, then through Indiana, into Boston, and before she went back home to Massachusetts. So that was before the next April's tour, when she came back right away for the 3-day convention with Douglas. And Blackwell took Brisbane's place that year in organizing the whole convention and did a great job doing that. Lucy Stone had resisted his proposals quite strongly because she was very much a feminist and didn't feel she needed to be married, but he finally broke her down by 1855. They got married in Massachusetts, and they signed the first prenup agreement that we've known in the nation. And he gave up all the rights special rights that a man would have to a woman's property or freedom. It was a very equal, probably the most equal marriage that took place in American history at that time, and maybe for quite a while. So they came back to Cincinnati for at least a year and a half, and she moved into the Blackwell family home. His mother was still alive with some amazing sisters, and this was very near the Stowe House in Walnut Hills. So here is Lucy, and she was born in Massachusetts. She was the first woman to graduate from Oberlin. She gave both anti-slavery and women's rights lectures in Cincinnati in October of '53 in that tour that Blackwell arranged. And while she was in town, J.P. Ball took this locket photo of her. And I just discovered that through documents at the Library of Congress, that this photo has been well produced, but we just found out that Ball is the one who took it. So as we know, she and Douglas were featured together at that amazing '54 convention, and she married Blackwell in '55. And her next big Cincinnati event was to defend Margaret Garner during the court case in 1856. Lucy Stone arranged to interview Garner in the Cincinnati jail while the trial was taking place, and she assured her that 1,000 hearts were beating with hers, understanding why she had killed her child to save it from going back to slavery. In the courtroom, she defended Garner's right to send her own child to heaven rather than back to slavery. And Douglas featured Stone's testimony as well as Garner's trial very prominently in his paper. Well, now we'll look briefly at 4 Black appearing Cincinnatians who enabled and enriched Douglas's visits here in the early '50s. I hope you'll recognize some of their names. I knew a little bit about them, but have learned more since. John Eisen Gaines was born in 1821. He emerged as a very inspiring orator during the terrible anti-Black riots in 1841. When he spoke up for the Black community about what had happened to so many of their fellow citizens. He became an agent for the North Star in Cincinnati as soon as Douglas founded the paper. He was a major player in repealing Ohio's Black laws in 1849. He gave an Emancipation Day address that year that was so good that Douglas published much of it in his paper. He was there to greet Douglas at the Spring Garden reception in 1850, and he gave a major address at that gala farewell for Douglas at Baker Street Baptist that Douglas praised very highly in his paper. In '53, he attended Douglas's Colored National Convention in Rochester, which was a famous convention for raising national consciousness. And in '54, he arranged that self-help address that Douglas gave at Zion Baptist to the Black community after the 3-day convention. Gaines was a regular contributor to Frederick Douglass's paper throughout the 1850s, including a little-known account of Margaret Garner in the Cincinnati courtroom, which he entitled Description of the Noble Heroine. And he argued she was noble because she cut her child's throat from ear to ear rather than see it returned to bondage. Our second Black Cincinnatian is William Watson, a barber, bathhouse operator, and entrepreneur who was a longtime trustee of Baker Street Baptist. He collaborated with Brisbane in the early 40s when Brisbane's First Baptist Church sold its Baker Street building to move somewhere else to Watson's Union Baptist Church, which became known as Baker Street Baptist for the next 2 decades at least. Watson also became a local agent for the North Star in 48. And in that year, he stayed in Douglas's home in Rochester when helping to officiate at the Emancipation Day there. Watson was among those who welcomed Douglas at Spring Garden in 1850. He coordinated those gala events at Baker Street while Douglas was in town. And he was praised by Douglas in several years, essays over the years, for his success in establishing himself through his own labor. He was also praised by Harriet Beecher Stowe in the last chapter of Uncle Tom's Cabin, where he's represented by the initial W, where she mentions a lot of Blacks who have succeeded in Cincinnati. There she described Watson as a 3/4 Black barber from Kentucky, 19 years free, paid for self and family over $3,000, worth $20,000. So our next Black Cincinnatian is J.P. Ball. He was first praised by Douglas in 1850 in the North Star. He went to Ball's gallery his first year in town and admired what he saw, and then the front page feature in 54. Ball photographed a lot of Cincinnati abolitionists, including Andrew Ernst, Brisbane, Harwood, Coffin, Henry Blackwell, Lucy Stone, and most of these photos have only recently been attributed to him. His only known photo of Douglas was during Douglas's return visit to Cincinnati in '67, but he may have done some of those unattributed photos of Douglas. We don't know who took them. As I mentioned, the front page image of Ball's Daguerrean Gallery of the West in '54 was the first engraving ever to appear in Douglas's paper. It was accompanied by a very long article praising paintings by Robert Duncanson, which were then being exhibited in Ball's gallery. And Douglas played a major role in making both Ball and Duncanson known nationally. The next year, '55, Ball put on his mammoth anti-slavery panorama in the same Greenwood Hall where the convention had been the year before. This was a canvas, 2,400 square feet on 2 spindles that took 2 hours to unroll before a live audience. It was painted by Black painters, probably supervised by Duncanson, who was then working for Ball's gallery. It was shown after premiering here. It was shown in Boston and Providence, Rhode Island, before disappearing from sight. About 5 years ago, a similar panorama was found in a barn in New Hampshire. So we can only hope that someday that may still come to light. So for now, all we have is the catalog for the panorama, but it is quite a lot. That's the cover on the left. It described every image that followed the horrors of slavery from the coast of Africa to Charleston and New Orleans, and then up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers through Cincinnati and the northern states to freedom in Canada. Our fourth Black Cincinnatian is Peter Clark. He was a nephew of John Gaines. In '53, he accompanied Gaines to that colored national convention that Douglas hosted in Rochester, where he served as secretary of the convention. In '54, he was active at that convention that featured Douglas and Stone, but also at the Black Self-Help meeting at Zion Baptist the day later. In '55, he published his own paper, The Herald of Freedom, for Cincinnati's Black community, but it died very soon for lack of support. So in '56, Clark moved to Rochester as assistant editor of Douglas's paper, and he ran the paper whenever Douglas was on tour, which was quite often. Like his uncle John Gaines, Peter Clark became a leading Cincinnati educator and served for 20 years as principal of Gaines High School. So, as you can see just from the little we've talked about, Douglas is very well known as an orator, author, editor, and political activist in Cincinnati in the 1850s, but also from the networking he did within both the Black and white communities, both in person and through his paper, all of which began at the reception at Spring Garden in 1850. So now I'm going to give a little post-war epilogue. Take a sip of water first. After the Civil War, Douglas lectured 4 times in Cincinnati between 1867 and 69, and his topics included perils to the Republic and the assassination of Lincoln and its lessons. J.P. Ball took this photo after Douglas's triumphant lecture to a huge mixed-race audience in Mozart Hall in January of '67. That was 1 week after the suspension bridge finally opened to traffic between Cincinnati and Covington. The Cincinnati Enquirer had been blatantly racist about Douglas in the 1850s, and that continued in the headline for this mixed race audience that attended this speech at Mozart Hall. The headline said, "Amalgamation in the Ascendant, Mingling of Odor and Sentiment, It Smells to the Upper Tier." That's hard to read even after all these years. In 1876, Douglas returned to Cincinnati as a delegate from the District of Columbia to the Republican National Convention that nominated Rutherford B. Hayes as its presidential candidate. Hayes had worked as a young lawyer in Cincinnati, defending Margaret Garner and other fugitives. William Brisbane was an official delegate to that same convention from Arena, Wisconsin. Now we're going to turn to women's rights in Cincinnati in honor of the 19th Amendment, which we're celebrating in this month. Sarah Ernst, William Brisbane, Frederick Douglass, Henry Blackwell, and Lucy Stone were all actively involved in the women's rights movement as well as the anti-slavery movement in the 1850s. For example, in January of '53, Sarah Ernst gave a women's rights lecture to an anti-slavery organization headed by Brisbane. And in October of that year, 1 week before Brisbane moved his whole family to Wisconsin, he attended a full week of lectures that Lucy Stone and Lucretia Mott were giving on women's rights and anti-slavery, organized by Sarah Ernst. After their marriage in May 1855, Lucy Stone and Henry Brisbane became the nation's leading mixed gender advocates for women's rights all the way until Lucy's death in 1893. Back in October of '55, a few months after their marriage, Stone hosted the 6th National Women's Rights Convention in Cincinnati, only 7 years after that famous Seneca Falls meeting Douglas had attended in '48. In 1869, the women's rights movement split over Black voting rights and the 15th Amendment. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton announced they would not support Black voting rights unless women got their votes first. Stone and Blackwell continued to support both women's rights and the 15th Amendment. They formed their own American Women's Suffrage Association and worked tirelessly for women's voting rights within individual states, and especially in the Western states. In 1888, their American Women's Association held its 18th annual national convention in Cincinnati and invited Douglas as the featured speaker. The Cincinnati Enquirer, that had been so blatantly racist in covering Douglas in the 50s and again in '67, expressed genuine respect in '88. Its reporter declared that, quote, "With his almost flowing white hair, standing out in sharp contrast to the African hue of his skin, his strength of feature and his power of physique, added to his reputation for intellectual vigor, combine to make up a personality that has no counterpart in any land. There's a nice tribute. So the two women's rights organizations finally did reunite in 1890. Sorry about the typo. Lucy Stone died in 93. And the next year, Douglass gave a eulogy for her, declaring that no person had ever been so loyal to both racial justice and women's rights. In 95, he died himself at the door of his Cedar Hills home in Washington, D.C., as he returned from a meeting of the United National American Women's Rights Association. I will conclude this presentation with the headline that appeared the next day in the Cincinnati Enquirer. Gasped and fell back dying. Fred Douglass, the great colored statesman, suddenly expires in his home at Washington. He had just returned from the Women's Convention and was telling his wife what he had heard. Remarkable career of a slave who obtained fame that was worldwide. So, thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions, I'll be happy to take them. And I think Christina's going to field them.
Yes, thank you very much. If you can stop sharing screen.
Okay.
Then we will, oops. Yes. Then we can get to the questions and answers. Okay, hang on.
No, do I need to click out this?
Nope. Okay. All right. So anyway, at any rate, thank you very much. We did have a number of questions that came in, and I tried to answer a couple of them that I was able to by typing. There were a couple of people that did ask something in regards to, is the Margaret Garner story connected to Beloved in some way? And I said yes, that Margaret Garner story is kind of a reimagined in Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. So they have a similar kind of storyline. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yes, Toni Morrison claimed, and I think it may well be true, that she had only seen a newspaper clipping from 1856 talking about the event. And she was so moved by that she decided to just use her own imagination to figure out what it would have meant for a woman to take the life of a child under those circumstances. So she apparently did not know all the details of what happened either before or after the event and the trial.
Okay, all right. There was another question, just quick, maybe quick. What do we mean by the term Garrisonians?
Well, Garrison founded an American Anti-Slavery Association in the 30s, and it was a very strong movement. And so he believed that that the U.S. Constitution supported slavery, and for that reason, there was no reason to act with any political party which could never be successful, so that all you could do is change the imagination of people through what he called moral suasion. So he was very tough on political parties, and he also was tough on any Christian church that had not fully renounced slavery, and not many of them had by that time. So he was kind of going alone in a very high mode that was quite successful in raising the issue nationally, but he was also pretty tough on anyone who took different points of view. So in a way, a Garrisonian was for a while, for a long time, someone who didn't approve of any other way of trying to attack slavery than the Garrisonian way.
Okay. Another question, is there one book that you can recommend that contains all of Frederick Douglass's speeches?
Yes. There's a new book about his speeches that came out from the Frederick Douglass Papers Project in Indianapolis. And that project is run by Yale University Press, but it's actually operated in Indianapolis. And they have gathered about 20 of his most famous speeches and ones that mean most to us today. That's in a nice paperback you can get from Yale University Press. Another book I'd recommend, it's a much bigger one. It's about 900 pages, but it's by Foner. It's a paperback, and it has selected speeches and essays by Douglas that goes through his whole career. I use that in teaching. It's an incredible resource. So those are two things I would recommend very highly.
Okay, and you said the last one was by Eric Foner?
Yeah, no, it was Philip Foner, his father.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so there was a question about the John Gaines, and the spring, he was mentioned with the spring garden, and then later in the presentation with the African Americans in Cincinnati. And the question is, was that Gaines somehow related to the Gaines family that had enslaved the Garners?
That's a great.
Or is that just a coincidence?
I think it is coincidence as far as I know. However, it's hard to know for sure.
Okay.
Partly because there were so many mixed race people at the time, and his uncle, Peter Clark, actually married an enslaved woman from Cynthiana, a black woman who had children with her white slave master, and managed to get her freedom and go to Cincinnati. So she was a mixed race person, and Clark was a mixed race person, as Douglas was a mixed race person. And that's why I said black appearing versus white appearing, because Duncanson, Ball, Clark, so many of the people we call black today were mixed race. So, and so they're within, John Gaines's own family. His nephew, who was almost as old as he was directly related to people related to slaveholders in Cynthiana, as opposed to Walton and Richwood. So, it would be impossible to say, I believe, that there was no possible relation between those two Gaines families.
Okay. Next question is about this Spring Grove Cemetery somehow named after the Spring Garden. And are there any of the...
No, they have similar names. Several things they have in common. One is that, Ernst was this great horticulturalist, and he and Brisbane were among the first subscribers to the Spring Grove Cemetery. And in fact, one of Brisbane's daughters, Julia, who married Julia, who died of whooping cough at a 1.5 years age, was the first person ever buried in Spring Grove. So these guys are the founders of Spring Grove, as well as Cincinnati anti-slavery. And many of the trees that were planted in Spring Grove when the landscaping was done came from Ernst's nursery. So Ernst was very deeply involved in conceiving and carrying out the cemetery itself. But I think it's a coincidence that Spring Grove and Spring Nursery had a similar name, but it's not surprising. It makes sense given his deep involvement in creating both, actually.
Okay. This question is sort of related, and that is that for many years, apparently, there was a savings and loan on the west side known as Spring Garden Savings and Loan. And is that connected to the Ernst family and were they involved in this venture?
That is a very good question. Ernst had brothers and sons, and some of them, one of the brothers ran a bookstore in Cincinnati. One of the sons invested in Covington. And it was interesting, Brisbane and Ernst both had relatives and bought land in Covington. There was a lot of cross-river commerce at the time, even among the anti-slavery advocates. So I think given the name, it's probably likely that somebody related in some way to Andrew Ernst ran that savings and loan. I had not heard the name of it before.
Okay. All right, here's my next question. And that is, during your research, have you come across names of any conductors from Cincinnati and then over into Harrison and up to Brookville?
Over into Harrison and up to Brookville, is it?
Brookville, Indiana.
Yeah. I haven't myself, partly because those records were, pretty well disguised. Although if somebody knew the names, you could probably find them in Brisbane's diary. Like, he and Coffin made trips to Indiana to attend anti-slavery, and they were also big advocates of slave-free, goods to be sold. And so Brisbane was in Harrison all the time. I've come across the names of anti-slavery people at state conventions from Harrison. So if somebody read Brisbane's diary, for example, I'm sure they would find people from Harrison and all over the place in our region.
Okay. All right. Next question. Someone says, having visited the sites of a few of the places you mentioned, like the Zion Baptist Church at 3rd and the Ladies Anti-Slavery and Sewing Society on 6th, they are often unmarked. Do you think memorializing these sites with historical markers is important to modern anti-racism? That's kind of the first question. And how could the public support scholars who do this work?
Well, I think it's very important. It's a really, inspiring history of what our city did for anti-slavery in these years. And there's very little notice of it physically in the city, and there's still not much of a historical record either. So there are all sorts of ways that this could be done. And certainly Zion Baptist, Baker Street Baptist, and other sites throughout the city deserve to have plaques or markers of some kind. And I was interested, to learn more about where Brisbane and the Ernst lived. And I went over to where the nursery was, where Spring Garden was. And it's right off of State Street, just before you get to the viaduct there. And there's a little road that angles off of State Street that is Ernst Street. That street is still named for them. I'm sure nobody makes the connection anymore. And you can drive up that little narrow street. There's just one house there. It's a house from the 19th century. I thought it might have been the Ernst house itself. But it turns out it was built in 1866. So it's pretty close to the house that was on the site when Douglas was there. So, and Brisbane's house still exists in Cheviot. It's owned privately. You could certainly have a marker there. And all over the city, there were activists who did pretty amazing things under great social pressure. So I think definitely we need to have historical societies, or whoever has the ability to do this, to have markers and other ways to commemorate things. They're also at the Freedom Center, they have that big central gallery with the history of the Underground Railroad in Cincinnati. And all sorts of little details from what happened are scattered around there, but there's no complete story of what these amazing abolitionists managed to pull off. And a lot of them are mentioned for their national importance without it being recognized that they were here lecturing and organizing. So I've talked with people there over the years, and I've heard that actually that display was given under conditions where it's very hard to change it. So I would hope that we could change it and update that in some way to show all the people who were active in so many ways.
Okay. The next question, I think I already answered on the chat or on the question and answer thing, but Henry Blackwell, he was the brother of Elizabeth Blackwell, the first female physician in the United States. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay.
They were quite a pair.
And their house was actually located just south of where the Harriet Beecher Stowe House is, pretty much where Jim and Eddie's is today. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to the walking tour in September to find out exactly where that was.
Okay. Let's see. I do have a few more that came in after that I haven't written down yet, so I need to kind of go through this here. Okay, so it's interesting to see that the Cincinnati Enquirer had a change of heart from racist statements about Douglas to respect. Do you know what caused this shift?
That's a good question. The first thing I'll say about that is that Douglas was really interesting that way. He liked to be praised, and he got a lot of praise because he was so damn talented. But he was always interested in those who didn't agree, because he thought the important thing for social change is to convince the people in the middle or even your opponents. So he would print the Gazette stories, the reviews that were so great in his paper, but he would also reprint what the Cincinnati Times at the time was neutral. It would give and take away, and as they praised him, but then demeaned him at the same time. And he would reprint what they said, hoping that they would get better. And he also would sometimes show what the Enquirer was doing and hoping that it might change. There wasn't any hope for change there in the 50s. And actually, in the Enquirer in 67, with that terrible headline, unbelievable, the story itself was actually more balanced, although it had, terrible paragraphs about Black women next to white men and all that sort of thing. But they did at least give a fairly detailed abstract of his actual talk. The Gazette published the whole damn talk. It was an hour and a half long in the paper. The Enquirer really gave a decent abstract of it. At the same time, they were throwing the red meat to the other half of its readership. So the Enquirer seems to, I have not studied this issue, but the Enquirer seems to have gone through quite a editorial or management change between 67 and 88. I would say mainly, in my experience, comparable to that between the Enquirer in the 1970s and the Enquirer today. I would say it's a very similar change in its attitude towards social movement. I'm not sure exactly what led to that, but it had another feature in the coverage of that Women's Rights Convention in 88. It had total praise for what was going on, and that was not true of the Enquirer or any Cincinnati paper early on. And that particular journalist noted that for the first time in 88, the top Cincinnati socialites, women, were in town, and mentioned Louise Taft, I think widower by then of Alphonso Taft, the founder of the Republican Party, and also the wife of Willie Taft, later the President of the United States. The Taft women were both there prominently in 88 at the Women's Rights Conference. And this guy said it's the first time that the top social rung of Cincinnati women were really supporting in a big way this conference. So I think the Enquirer changed, evolved over this time, but it's clear the society was evolving. And this is what Douglas believed in. It was impossible to think in the 1850s that you would have abolition in the 1860s. I mean, even Lincoln was 8 years behind Douglas, and even Chase was 5 years behind Douglas. There just were not people who could see that we could get beyond slavery, just as there were never people who could see or even have a place to think that women and men could be equal. So, Ernst and Douglas and Brisbane and Blackwell, these people just had amazing social imaginations of what might be at a time when it was hard to envision. So they and like-minded people eventually brought the society along, and the newspapers came as well, even the Enquirer, which was hard to imagine when you saw the really stuff they were writing in the 50s in particular.
Okay, the next question it probably will be a little shorter. Where was the Dumas Hotel located, and where did you get the photo?
I got that photo out of a book on Black Cincinnati by Dabney.
Okay.
And I had to reproduce it out of that book. It must exist in one of our historical societies. I haven't seen it yet. It's not easy to find on the web, and I'll have to get permission somehow when a book comes out, if I hope it does. But where it is or was, it's on 4th Street, just east of where Western Southern Insurance Company is now. As you're walking on that way toward the Taft Museum and Lytle Park, there's a little alley that was called McAllister Street, and now it's just kind of an alley. And so the view I showed was looking south on McAllister Avenue at Dumas' house on the left, as it at the end of the photo hit 4th Street. So it was actually a block and a half east of College Hall, where Douglas gave his talks, and 2 blocks east of J.P. Ball's Daguerrean Gallery. So all of this stuff was pretty close. So moving between the black and white communities in Cincinnati only took a block or two in a couple directions at that time.
Okay, next question. Someone is asking specifically about Brisbane. He repurchased his slaves and brought them to Cincinnati, and what purpose did that serve?
Well, to free them. They were still enslaved. He sold them to his brother-in-law in South Carolina, and then realized that they were still slaves. So he wanted them to be free. So he found the money. He raised money from real estate here. He made a real estate investment in downtown Covington, which helped to pay for a trustee deed that helped to free these slaves. So, and he had to go down there to actually deliver them, brought them back through Baltimore, and put them up in Cheviot in his house and the house of Samuel Lewis, who also lived in Cheviot. But they were attacked in these houses, and even a 70-year-old blind woman was attacked by white people who didn't like these new freed blacks coming in town. And a lot of them eventually got settled in Mercer County, Ohio, which happens to be where William Watson had a lot of big real estate investments with the money he'd made as a barber and bathhouse operator. So I'm pretty sure that William Watson probably had something to do with helping those formerly enslaved, now free blacks start up new lives, because it wasn't yet safe for them in Cheviot or Cincinnati.
Okay. Did Frederick Douglass comment on the 1829 race riots in Cincinnati and the Black exodus to Canada that followed?
He didn't comment directly that I know of, because he was still young then when it happened. However, in 41, when we had that 3rd riot, which was even more brutal in some ways, he was then working for Garrison. Garrison discovered him. We use the word discover in Nantucket in August of 41. But of course, Douglass had already become a spokesman for the Black community in New Bedford by that time. So he was already somebody before Garrison so-called discovered him. At any rate, he started working for Garrison, and he gave a talk in Plymouth County, Massachusetts, in 41, when that riot had just taken place in Cincinnati, and Garrison covered stuff like that really well. So at the convention where Douglass spoke, and they described him as a young Spartacus, it was be incredible to see him, 2 months out of starting to lecture for Garrison's organization. And at that conference, they had resolutions, and one of which resolutions attacked the brutality of Cincinnatians who had conducted this riot against its black citizens. And Douglas was recorded in the Liberator magazine as among those who spoke out in favor of that resolution. So there he was in just joining Garrison's organization, but knowing how brutal Cincinnati was toward black people in 41. So that's one reason it would have been a frightening place for him to go to, and his fellow Garrisonians would have known what had happened in Cincinnati just 2 years earlier when they suggested better not go there now in 43, especially after what happened in Pendleton. So from that moment on, Cincinnati was on his radar. Yet he heard so many good things about it, especially from Delaney in 1848, that he soon came to think that the hope for anti-slavery was in the West more than in the East, which really turned out to be the case. Not only with Lincoln and the Republican Party rising here, but with all the consciousness raising that took place here and in other Western cities.
So we have, it looks like about 10 questions left still. So I just wanted to let people know that we'll continue going on, but I wanted to get to a couple things before, because some people are kind of dropping off the recording or the show at this point. But number one, we will offer a recording of this, but it will probably not be available until sometime in early September. And that'll go onto our YouTube channel with the rest of our discussions and lecture things. Second, and that is, some people have asked when your book is coming out, and we will give people information about that once it does come out. But do you have any idea of when that will be?
The book is being read by a publisher right now, and I'm awaiting its readers' reports. So if the readers are positive, I'll have some revising to do, and then we'll go ahead. So these things take years. I started the project about 5 years ago, and they tend to be 7 or 8 year projects before they come into being.
Okay. All right. Well, we will keep you posted. All right. Let's get back to the questions. John Gaines appears to be only 38 when he died. Do you know what he died from?
He had health problems. I'm not sure exactly what it was. I think it may have been what they called consumption at the time, but I'm not certain.
Okay.
And there is a monument to him in the a cemetery off of Duck Creek Road by Red Bank, near that intersection.
Oh, the American.
The American Cemetery. You can find it there. There's a pretty big, nice memorial to him. The top's broken off, but his name and life are well honored there.
Okay. This actually came in at an email, and I was reminded to have it in the email, but this is a shorter version of that question. And it's basically, do you have any information about why Douglas was negative to the Black lawyer John Mercer Langston when Langston stood for Senate to represent the Western District of Virginia in 1880?
There's a knowledgeable question.
Yes, she's actually written some historical novels. So
yes, they were great colleagues in the early years. On that trip in 1850, when after the talk here, when Douglas went on to speak in Columbus and in Eastern Ohio and also Pittsburgh, Langston went with him. They were partners. And when Douglas's voice gave out, Langston carried on. Langston was a major player at that 53 convention in Rochester, and Douglas gave him a lot of attention there because he argued very effectively for the fact that Blacks can be successful in any occupation here, and quoted the success of Duncanson and so many others here. So they were really working together very well throughout the 1850s, through the Civil War, into the post-war years. But what happened is that Douglas, after the war, became an absolute loyalist to the Republican Party. And in that particular election, as I understand it, Mercer was running to be a congressman, I believe, against the regular Republican candidate. And Douglas went for the regular party candidate rather than a challenger who he had admired. So that they did have some differences strategically after the war, but I think mainly it was that kind of absolute fealty to the Republican Party, which Douglas stayed with. And it's interesting because some other Republicans who were very strong in the anti-slavery movement got disaffected with the Republicans in the 70s and 80s and moved to the Republicans or third parties. Actually, Peter Clark became a socialist at the end of his life. He was disillusioned with the Republicans, and Mercer was too, but Douglas stayed with the party. So I think that was the main reason of the difference, although there was certainly some rivalry too, because Douglas stayed very prominent forever, and Mercer had come up kind of as an acolyte of his and never managed to get equal treatment to Douglas. So that could have been a factor as well.
Okay, all right, here is another question that is, there's no connection between J.P. Ball and the earlier photos of Frederick Douglass that you know of before that 1867 photo?
There could be. There's no known collection. There's no known connection. And those daguerreotypes, all those, they're like 9 basic images of Douglas between 1850 and 56. And I think 5 or 6 of the 9 are still unattributed. We don't know who took them because the daguerreotypes often came in these nice brass cases. And few times the name or initial of the photographer would be engraved on the case, but more often than not, they were not. So, and they used similar cases that were like nationally produced, so you couldn't tell where it came from just by looking at the case. So you either need to have some stylistic thing about how the photographer seated people or some background, but often it was a neutral background. So unless you get other information, it's hard to know. So in that amazing triple daguerreotype, the Wisconsin Historical Society, which owns it, had listed it as photographer unknown. I was able to attribute it to Ball because in Levi Coffin's autobiography in 1876, which is well known, he had Brisbane write an introduction. And Brisbane, who was still alive, it was 2 years later he would die, he described that daguerreotype itself and identified himself and Harwood and Coffin and said that they'd all gone to Ball's gallery to have this done. So that cinched the fact that it was by Ball, but if he hadn't written that, we would have no way of knowing for sure. So it could well be that some of these other images were by Ball. I'd love to think the 56 one, that stern, powerful image of Douglas, could have been Douglas in Cincinnati right after Garner was sent back. I think that the look, of course, that's also where the culture was in 56, not just in Cincinnati. So I hope someday we'll get more information about some of these.
All right, here is a question I'm also curious about. And do you know what connections Douglas had with Henry Boyd, the black furniture maker and Underground Railroad leader near 6th and Broadway?
Yes. Douglas praised Boyd every chance he got in Cincinnati, first in the 1850 essay, and again in 52 and 54. And I don't know, he obviously went to his studio. He wrote sometimes a whole paragraph about the operation. And I think it was in Douglas's paper that he talked later, maybe 54, 56, about how Boyd was the leading manufacturer of chairs and beds and whatever in Cincinnati, and that he hired a lot of white workers who were working for this black person. So, you know, with Douglas and Mercer, who were the great protagonists for what black artisans could do in Cincinnati, Boyd was just an incredible person who had freed himself. He was a former slave, to show how successful a Black could be if given the chance. So he was a poster boy for Black success. Boyd as a furniture maker and Watson as a barber, bathhouse operator, and church trustee. These were two people that Douglass furthered whenever he could, and he did a lot to make their national reputations, actually.
Okay, this question, there's two questions that go together. Where was the Baker Street Baptist located? And is Baker Street the same as Union Baptist, which is still in operation? It
is the same church. It goes all the way back, and actually it had been Eben Baptist before that. And that congregation had actually been part of the first Baptist church that Brisbane came to be the pastor of. But in 1835, while Brisbane was still, he was actually editing a pro-slavery paper in Charleston in 35. In that year, the Black members of the First Baptist Church decided to go out on their own and call themselves, this is Eben Baptist, and then they broke into the First Baptist, and anyway, a mixed race church split, and the whites became First Baptist, and the Blacks became Union Baptist, which bought out the former Baker Street Church of the other one, and became Baker Street, and then later they moved elsewhere and to Mound Street, and they kind of took the Union Baptist. They were also called the Colored American Church at a while. They had about 4 rotating names, but anyway, it was on 3rd and Walnut, 3rd near Walnut, and it was in the quite a capacious building. And when they had that gala farewell for Douglass in 50, they were able to go into the night because they had installed gas lighting in 1850 before Douglass came. So they were a quite prosperous church. They were civic leaders. They were an amazing congregation. So for a while, they were literally affiliated with that Baptist church, but then they really became totally independent. When they bought that church, they bought it full. And Douglass mentioned this, that they purchased it with their full money completely from the original First Baptist Church. So it was a pretty amazing congregation, and served for, it was a meeting place for Blacks and whites to meet together. In fact, when they famously gave a silver pitcher to Salmon P. Chase at a public meeting for the work he'd done to support the fugitives. And that silver pitcher was found recently, donated by a Black descendant, and you can see it at the Freedom Center.
Okay, here's what I'm gonna do. It is almost 5:30. We're not gonna stop yet, but what I'm gonna do is kind of do a little wrap up for people who there's a lot of people kind of dropping off, which is fine. I know people have things to do on a Sunday. So I'm gonna do a little wrap up, and then I will go back to answering questions. As long as you're okay with continuing, we'll continue for a few more. So thank you so much to Dr. Wallace. I certainly learned a lot of information and had fun. On behalf of the board and staff of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House, I do want to thank you for spending part of your Sunday with us. Please check out our website at stowehousecincy.org to see upcoming discussion groups, exhibits, and lectures. You can also make a donation through our website's donate button, and to become a member, click on the Get Involved tab, and then the Membership Information tab, and that'll give you instructions for how to become a member as well. So that's kind of my little wrap up for people who are who need to leave, but I will go back to some of our questions. Actually, here's a couple of comments. Fred says, I believe that Philip Foner was Eric's Foner's uncle, not his father.
That could well be. I'll take Fred's word for that.
There you go. Okay. And then this is more of a comment as well. Given that Rutherford worked for Margaret Garner, isn't his 1876 sellout of Reconstruction especially sad?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you want me to elaborate a little bit?
Probably don't need to, but
I think there's a big story there.
okay, well, go ahead.
Okay. That election was contested and eventually went to Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And he had, Alfonso Taft was Attorney General for Grant at that time, the founder of the Republican Party here in Cincinnati. And there was a congressional convention that was set up to decide the election because it was a tie in the Electoral College, but some people, certain person might hope would happen this year and throw it all back to Congress. At any rate, that decision was made by a congressional committee that awarded the election to Hayes on the condition that federal troops be removed from the South.
Mm-hmm.
He had no choice about that, I think. The country was too paralyzed for him to hold the line, and he wouldn't have become president if he didn't make that devil's bargain. But I think that he was very anti-slavery. He was very pro-Black. And as president, he did as much as he could under the circumstances, but it was that election and the fact that it was a split election that caused the death of Reconstruction. And unfortunately, he was the one who had to hold the pieces together. So I have some sympathy for him in that situation.
Okay, this question, I'm not sure I understand. There might be a typo in it, but I noticed Douglas did not speak publicly until after the Civil War. And did the Civil War disrupt anti-slavery movements, or did it enhance them?
Oh, you mean?
I think the Civil War part.
He spoke publicly throughout the Civil War. He didn't speak in Cincinnati, so far as I know.
Okay.
Civil War, but there was a speech scheduled in '64, I think, and it may have been the disruption of rail lines which kept him from coming.
Okay.
And but he stayed obviously more on the East Coast while the war was going on.
Okay. Ernst is also a common name in Boone County, Kentucky. Are they related?
That's a good question too. I wouldn't be surprised because there was so much familial relationships among Northern Kentucky and Cincinnati, just as there is right now. So it could well be that Ernst and Boone, well, obviously his own son lived in Covington for a long time. And it could well be that direct descendants of him stayed in Northern Kentucky and Boone County. I don't know of any brother or sister in his period that actually lived there, but there was so much interchange that it would take some time to figure that out. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's a relationship, especially if it's spelled the same way, because Ernst often has an E in it. This is just E-R-N-S-T, which does misspelled in that article in the Anti-Slavery Bugle I showed, but it could be that was done when he wasn't yet in town. So anyway, that's a very good question. I think, we need to know a lot more about what these two areas of Greater Cincinnati had in common, even though they did differ on slavery.
This one is more of a comment. It says Cincinnati Commercial was more sympathetic newspaper for the Black community.
Yes, it was. And it started to show that in the 40s or in the 50s. The Gazette was the big one for a while. The Gazette took a pause for a while. It kind of went in the know-nothing direction for a while, which was a bit surprising. The Commercial, I think, was active in the 50s in some pro-abolitionist or certainly pro-anti-slavery coverage. And then after the Civil War, the Commercial became a very strong civil rights type newspaper, and with both women's rights and covering the Black community. And it did cover Douglas and others well when they came to the city. And certainly when the Democratic Convention was here, the Commercial gave good coverage. One unfortunate thing about trying to study Cincinnati newspapers is that the Enquirer is the only one that is online throughout the 19th century. So you can look what it had to say about things. but you have to go into the actual microfilms or hard copies of the, I wish the Gazette was digitized. I hope someday the commercial would be. They're great vehicles, and it's too bad to think that in the 19th century, people doing online research would think that the Enquirer represented the views of Cincinnati, which was a very strong view, but very much on the conservative side of things.
Okay, so the next question, Douglas School, which is now in Walnut Hills, is named after Frederick Douglass.
Yes.
He did not, I don't think he visited there because it wasn't renamed that until 1902, and Jeff Sutton can correct me if I'm wrong. But so it was called Elm Street School before that. So I don't think it was named after him until after he had passed. But the question part of this here is, didn't J.P. Ball also photograph actress Jenny Lind and Queen Victoria?
I think he did. He's said to have photographed Queen Victoria on a trip to England. She didn't come here, as far as I know, to Cincinnati to be photographed. But I think we've had a difficult time documenting that trip to England of Ball. And I don't know if that photo actually exists. And Jenny Lind, probably, because I'm sure, yes, in fact, she was mentioned in that article because she came in the 50s, and one convention, I think in 52, she was here while this convention was going on, and Samuel P. Chase hung out at her recitals all the time and only stuck his nose in briefly at the anti-slavery thing. So she was a real presence in Cincinnati, and white people who came through who had high popularity would go to Ball's gallery and be photographed. So I haven't looked for her photo in particular, but they probably have it at the museum center.
Okay. Jeff says that Cincinnati Public Library does give access to the commercial. So that is good to know. Here's another question. Well, someone would like me to post the editor's titles of the Douglas speech text that you had mentioned. So if you just want to email me the information for those two books that we talked about at the very beginning of the question and answer, then yes, I will give that out to people as well.
I can pull them off the shelf if you want.
Okay.
Can I do it that way? Or just let me send the info.
Just send them to me, and then I'll make sure they get to the person asking the question.
That's great.
Published. All right. It looks like we have one more question. When I recently told an educator that I had read the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, she remarked that Frederick Douglass had been found to have exaggerated in some of his stories. Is this true to your research? And is this what some people think? And where did this thinking come from?
I think I would say myself that is fake news.
Okay.
But I mean, every autobiography has a certain point of view on their life they want to get across. And certainly the Southerners attacked him and said he was making up stuff. But, he had a way of carrying the actual statutes of Georgia and South Carolina around in his back pocket. And he would pull those out to say what the laws actually said if people accused him of exaggerating. And most people, including the literary critics, are always looking at how autobiographies and memoirs are doctored up in one or the other. Everyone seems to acknowledge that his autobiographies are very accurate. And his tone is very measured and balanced. And, when he talks about Mrs. Auld teaching him to read, and then Mr. Auld keeping her from doing that as a young boy, and that kept him from, learning English. And Mr. Auld, he writes about how he was grateful to Mr. Auld because he learned from what Mr. Auld did what anti-slavery people do. You learn from your enemies. But he also, in the next chapter, was saying how unfortunate it was because he realized she had become diminished by what her husband had kept her from doing. So he had a lot of sympathy for the multidimensionality of both Black and white people. And he was very measured, I think, in his 1845 narrative, and also in, I think, his very best autobiography, My Bondage, My Freedom, which I didn't mention today, but he published that in 55, right in the middle of his Cincinnati period. It's an amazing autobiography, and he has grown so much in 10 years, but I think he's as honest in that biography as in the other ones. So I did not feel that as a problem, but I always invite my students to take any autobiography with a grain of salt and to make their own decision on what they feel the author is bringing to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, there was one other, like I said, that looked like the last question. Someone asked me a question about a question, so give me just another minute to see if she responds. And then we still have over 50 people hanging out with us right now. So
that's great.
That's exciting and great. And I will just say, I will give just another minute if anybody wants to type another question in there.
In the meantime, I'll thank all the hangers on. Thanks for sticking.
And definitely, I want to thank everyone as well for coming today and for hanging out with us and learning all that you can learn and all that we can share about Frederick Douglass and anti-slavery activity in Cincinnati. So, a couple people have said thank you for this wonderful and informative program. So I want to make sure that gets put out there too. I'm not getting any more responses. So like I said, we will put this kind of, condense down the problem issues at the beginning and so forth, and we'll put it onto our website, or not website, sorry, we'll put it on our YouTube channel, but that will come out later in sometime in September. So with that, and bibliographic info available. Sure, yeah, so we will make sure that the information that I get from Dr. Wallace about the books that he talked about, I will send that out to everybody who attended. All right. Thank you so much. And I'm going to go ahead and have us sign off for today. But again, thank you all for coming, and check out our website for the next lecture, the next discussion group. We have a workshop coming, or a panel discussion coming up in October as well. So all of that information will be updated by the beginning of September for kind of our fall lineup. And we'll go ahead and sign off for today. Thank you, Dr. Wallace. I appreciate it.
Thanks again for inviting me to give this talk.